now I'll turn the mics over to Bernie for his presentation, Beyond Pain, Alleviating Suffering in Laboratory Animals. It's all yours.
Thank you. Well, I'm very grateful for this award for a multiplicity of reasons, not the least of which, as Chris mentioned, is it's an acknowledgement not so much of my work, but of the legitimacy of field of concern with the treatment of animals, which wasn't always the case, as many of you well know, at least those of you who are a little bit older. And so it's very gratifying on a societal level as well as on a personal level. I'm going to run through a little bit of what I see as the future in this area. In 1980, my colleagues at Colorado State University and I appeared before Henry Waxman's Congressional Committee to testify regarding what became the 1985 laboratory animal laws, which required, as you all know, pain control for any animals upon whom pain would be inflicted in the course of research. Almost no analgesia was deployed in those days, even for painful research. Waxman asserted that the medical research community assured him that analgesia was used in a very liberal, even exaggerated manner. I knew for a fact that that was not the case from roughly 2 or 3 phone calls a month that I would get from technicians, lab animal technicians, who just deplored the degree of suffering that was extant. Waxman, in turn, however, affirmed that the burden of proof was upon me and my colleagues to prove that it was not so used. To do so, I visited a colleague who worked at the National Agricultural Library and asked him to do a literature search under the rubric of research animal analgesia, and his search yielded no results. I then asked him to search under the more general category of animal analgesia, and that search yielded 2 papers, one of which affirmed that there ought to be papers, and the other affirmed that very little was known or available on the subject. During the same year, actually, I was invited to lecture at the University of London for UFA on the teaching of moral responsibility. As it happened, there was a conference being held at the university on pain. The featured speaker was a renowned Scottish expert on animal pain, who affirmed to my amazement that animals did not experience pain in any sense we could understand, since the pain experience was processed through the cerebral cortex, and the electrochemical activity in an animal's cerebral cortex was significantly different from that of humans. Though I was allotted 20 minutes to respond to him by the organizers, and I'm usually quite verbose, I informed the audience that I would need only 5 minutes. Dr. X, I began, you are a very eminent pain researcher. Thank you very much, he replied. If I'm not mistaken, I continued, you do your research on dogs. That's correct, he responded. Then you extrapolate your results to people, I affirmed. Yes, he replied, that's the purpose of my research. If that's the case, I continued, either your speech this afternoon is false or your life's work is. In other words, if what he had, I'm not a nice guy. And I seem like a nice guy, I'm wearing a tie. In other words, if what he had affirmed in his speech were correct, that is, animal pain were thoroughly dissimilar to human pain, he could not extrapolate the animal results to humans. Fair enough? Okay. Dr. X was reflecting a very common, poorly thought out ideological attitude rampant at that time among scientists regarding animal pain, or indeed any animal subjective experience at all. This attitude, which I have characterized elsewhere as scientific ideology, or the common sense of science, largely in a book published with Cambridge called Science and Ethics, which makes a very thoughtful bar mitzvah present. This ideology is to science what ordinary common sense is to ordinary experience, and contains, ironically, numerous components which have driven a rift between scientists and ordinary people. Ideologies, as you all know, are strongly held, virtually unshakable beliefs that determine how those who believe in the ideology look at the world. Common examples are religious ideology, racist ideology, Marxist ideology, Nazi ideology, etc. Think for a moment how difficult it is to dislodge the belief that all black people are stupid from a thoroughgoing racist, or the congruent belief that all Jews are evil from a Nazi. Adherence to such a belief in turn explains how Nazis could easily murder small children, or how American racists could lynch African American looking at a white woman, or how Catholics could slaughter Protestants and vice versa for centuries in the name of doing God's will. Ideologies, of course, operate in many different areas: religious, political, sociological, economic, ethnic. Thus, it is not surprising that an ideology would emerge with regard to science, which is, after all, the dominant way of knowing about the world in Western societies, at least since the Renaissance. Inevitably, the great knowers, such as Aristotle, Francis Bacon, Isaac Newton, Albert Einstein, felt it necessary, and rightly so, to articulate what separated legitimate empirical knowledge from spurious knowledge, to guard and defend that methodology from encroachment by false pretenders to knowledge. Thus, the ideology underlying modern, i.e., post-medieval science, has grown and evolved along with science itself. And a major, perhaps the major component of that ideology is a very strong positivistic tendency, still regnant today, of believing that real science must be based in and only in experience, since the tribunal of experience is the objective, universal judge of what is really happening in the world. If one asks most working scientists what separates science from religion, speculative metaphysics, or shamanistic worldviews, they would unhesitatingly reply that it is an emphasis on validating all claims through sense experience, observation, or experimental manipulation. The insistence on experience as the bedrock for science continues from Newton to the 20th century in a fairly unbroken way, where it reaches its most philosophical articulation in the reductive movement known as logical positivism, a movement that was designed to excise the unverifiable from science. And as a kid who went to college in the 60s, we learned a healthy dose of positivism along with our basic science. The philosopher Ludwig Wittgenstein, who greatly influenced the logical positivists, once remarked that if you take an inventory of all the facts in the universe, you will not find it a fact that killing is wrong. In other words, ethics is not part of the furniture of the scientific universe. You cannot, in principle, test the proposition that killing is wrong. It can neither be verified nor falsified. So in Wittgenstein's view, empirically and scientifically, ethical judgments are meaningless. From this, it was concluded that ethics is outside the scope of science, which I have to say has done incalculable damage to the role of science in society, as are all judgments regarding values rather than facts. The slogan that I learned as early as the 60s, and which has persisted to the present and is still being taught in many places, is that science is value-free in general and ethics-free in particular. The denial in particular of the relevance of ethics to science was taught both explicitly and implicitly, and you could in fact find it explicitly stated in science textbooks. I taught biology with a botanist for 20 years, and there was not a textbook we could find that didn't stress that point at the beginning. The logical positivism that informed scientific ideology's rejection of the legitimacy of ethics dismissed moral discussion as empirically meaningless. That is not, however, the whole story. Positivist thinkers felt compelled to explain why intelligent people continued to make moral judgments and continued to argue about them, even though they were essentially meaningless. They explained the former by saying that when people make assertions such as killing is wrong, which appear to be statements about reality, they're in fact describing nothing. Rather, they are emoting, expressing their own revulsion at killing. Killing is wrong really means nothing more than killing yuck, rather than being descriptive of any state of affairs in the world. The same ideology was responsible for science's denial of the knowability of animal consciousness or even animal pain, as we illustrated earlier. Indeed, it was also responsible for the horrendous practice of doing open-heart surgery on neonates without anesthesia. Are you all familiar with that? Because we cannot know an infant feels pain. I remember lecturing at the International Pain Society one year. The radicals brought me in to attack this practice. And the fellow who wrote the position paper on that came up to me and he says, "Look, you were circumcised, right?" I said, "None of your damn business." I said, "Why?" He says, "Because, do you remember it?" I said, "No." He said, "See, it doesn't matter." Well, it certainly does matter. We now know through probably half of a decade of empirical investigation that children who were subjected to this atrocity grew up with a nervous system that had a strong tendency to grow up and be conducive to chronic pain. My colleagues and I worked diligently through the 70s and 80s to embody the necessity of controlling pain in animals in federal law, a goal we achieved in 1985 amendments to the Animal Welfare Act and in the NIH reauthorization bill. And it certainly worked. 2 years ago, I redid my literature search that I told you found no papers. Can you guess how many papers I found 2 years ago? 12,000. Have we then succeeded in controlling suffering in laboratory animals? Certainly things are far better than they were. Physical pain of the sort subject to control by analgesics is no small thing. The title of a recent book on the history of pain control says it all. If you haven't read this, I would recommend you read it. It's called The Worst of Evils. The very first writings on animal ethics, defined by Jeremy Bentham, defined human moral obligations to animals in terms of maximizing pleasure and minimizing pain. Indeed, for Bentham, as for all utilitarian thinkers, the ability to experience pain is the sine qua non for moral considerability. Bentham, in fact, devised what he called the philosophic calculus, a linear scale on which the magnitude of pain could be measured, calculating such features as intensity, duration, remoteness, and so on. This utilitarian approach to animal ethics is very laudable, but upon close examination reveals itself to be difficult, if not impossible, to implement. For example, whether the subject experiencing pain be a human or animal, it is extremely difficult to see how one weighs emotional pain against physical pain. An animal can suffer by virtue of the threat of a beating as compared with the actual beating. How then does one score the former in comparison to the latter? How does one score fear? How does one count the emotional pain of a cow whose baby is removed from her immediately upon being birthed, when we know that under normal extensive conditions she will not wean the calf for 7 to 9 months, sometimes longer? Of course, this is not a problem for scientific ideology, which simply denies emotions to animals. One of my favorite statements, by the way, by John Watson, who founded behaviorism, is, "We really don't have thoughts, we only think we do." Ponder that one. Let us recall that the dominant figure in modern biology, Charles Darwin, wrote a book entitled, pretty explicitly, The Expression of Emotion in Man and Animals, and assumed without question that if physiological and morphological traits were phylogenetically continuous, so too were mental traits. The major reason the scientific community has therefore failed to delineate emotions in animals is that it has not looked for them, but is currently under increasing pressure both from society and from visionary scientists like Jane Goodall to study them. To me, it's a very salubrious fact that society has become more and more concerned about animal treatment. And you can barely pick up the newspaper without finding reports of society rejecting caged chickens, or, of course, you all know about the orcas at SeaWorld, which lost 40% of its revenue in the wake of that movie documenting their behavior. Also, with the ideological push against articulating value judgments in science, there is further pressure not to discuss emotion. If, for example, in the course of research, one is creating fear or loneliness or social deprivation in the animals one is using, it is much, much harder to avoid moral judgments concerning one's research. And that's really a neglected problem in terms of what I call moral stress. We must now change gears in our discussion in order to fully discuss the control of suffering. A metaphysics is a way of looking at the world. Ordinary common sense finds that objects in the world are beautiful and ugly, good and bad, green and yellow, hot and cold, living and non-living, wet and dry, and indeed the entire host of qualitative categories that we use to talk about reality. On the other hand, the metaphysics introduced into modern science by Descartes, Newton, and others sees all of the above qualitative distinctions as ultimately unreal. As even the ancient atomists affirmed in 200 BC, by convention is sweet and sour, hot and cold, wet and dry. In reality, there is only atoms and empty space, atoms and void. Modern science considers as real only what is ultimately mathematically expressible. There are no words in physics and chemistry to describe the qualitative distinctions taken for granted in ordinary experience. In one's physicist and chemist moments, one speaks of reality as something totally devoid of what our sense experience tells us. At best, what the senses tell us are not ultimately real. They are, in fact, the byproducts of the atoms making up the world in interaction with the atoms making up our brains, sense organs, and nervous systems. On the other hand, the common sense world of ordinary experience takes for granted what our senses tell us. Some things are living, some are not. Some things are hot, others cold. Some things are poisonous, others are innocuous. So in contradistinction to the metaphysics underlying a scientific worldview, there is a metaphysics implicit in common experience and common sense, and that metaphysics attributes as much or more reality to the experiential world of qualitative differences as it does to the scientific world. The most articulate spokesperson of that metaphysics is Aristotle, who sees the world of reality as coextensive with the world of our experience, something the fathers of scientific revolution explicitly denied. And I'm sure at some point you all read Descartes' Meditations if you want a clear example of that explicit denial. Today's scientist therefore lives in two worlds: the world of ordinary experience, which scientists discredit as unreal, and the world described by physicochemistry. Ironically, most of his or her time is spent in a world he or she ideologically views as a false reality. Aristotle, on the other hand, lived in a united reality where science explains the world of our experience. Unlike the modern scientist, where one set of laws, the laws of physics and chemistry, explain all phenomena, in Aristotle's world, each kind of thing obeyed its own unique set of laws. Unlike the modern scientist who sees all phenomena as explained by physics and chemistry, which are the master sciences, Aristotle saw biology as the master science. For Aristotle, all things had a nature or unique function, which he called its telos, T-E-L-O-S, what it did. Whereas modern scientists see biology as reducible to physics, and indeed a science that is complete only when it is reduced to physicochemistry, Aristotle saw physics, as it were, as the biology of dead matter. For example, rocks were primarily made of earth, and the function of things made of earth was to go toward the natural place of earth, the center of the universe. Aristotle goes as far as to say that if you pick up a brick or a rock which is primarily made of earth, you can feel its inherent tendency to move downwards toward the center of the universe. Living things were naturally explained by how they performed the functions of living things. And by the way, it's fascinating to me that we still teach biology in an Aristotelian way. Aristotle said living things display sensation, locomotion, nutrition, and reproduction. All living things are characterized by these functions, but perform them in unique ways. A predator like a tiger finds food and eats in a manner different from an herbivore. A bird moves very differently from a snake. To know an animal for Aristotle is to know its telos, which we understand by observing numerous instances of the kind of creature it is and what it does. That is how we understand animals, not by reducing what they do to the laws of physics, excuse me, but by observing how they fulfill the function of living things. Whereas modern science reduces things to the mechanical, Aristotle is far more interested in the teleological, what people have called the pigness of a pig, the dogness of a dog. A moment's reflection makes it plain that Aristotle operates in the common sense world even as we do, and the goal of his science is to explain that world. And my own work in animal ethics since the late 70s is based on a return to Aristotle's worldview. It's not a denial of the scientific worldview, it's complementary. When we begin to think of animals in moral terms and how we manage them, the most important criterion, in my view, is to respect their telos. Indeed, respecting telos made possible traditional agriculture. Respecting the animal's interests made it possible to utilize animals pursuant to our own interest. That was traditionally meant by the phrase, good husbandry. And it's interesting that until about the 1950s, any of you have degrees in animal science? Okay, you remember that before the 50s, animal science was called animal husbandry, very explicitly so. And animal husbandry was typified by the Good Shepherd described in the 23rd Psalm. We want no more from God than what the Good Shepherd provides to the animals under his protection. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. The problem with industrialized confinement agriculture is that it is totally violative of the animal's telos, forcing square pegs into round holes with the resulting friction, creating suffering, but not affecting profitability by virtue of what I call technological sanders, like, for example, the widespread use of antibiotics. If we wish to assure animal well-being, respect for the animal's telos is as important, or probably more important, than avoiding physical pain. The pain of a surgical procedure can be rendered tolerable and minimized by the proper use of analgesics, something you all know well. But the suffering engendered by keeping a social animal caged individually is not remedied by drugs. The separation of calf from cow at day one is not alleviated by narcotics. A more striking and dramatic example is provided by coyotes and wolves that are caught in steel-jawed traps. These animals have been known to chew their paws off in order to escape. Since the physical pain of being held in a trap is far less horrendous than the pain of chewing off one's limb, we have to conclude that being kept immobilized is a far worse experience than even very severe physical pain is to the animal. A non-obvious example of violating animal nature can be found in a story recounted by Hal Markowitz, an expert on behavioral enrichment of environments for captive animals. Markowitz recounts that the Portland, Oregon Zoo built a showpiece exhibit for servals. Servals are, I'm not talking about graduate students, they're serval in a different way. It's a South African bobcat, even importing sand and plants from the Kalahari. The exhibit was a dud. The servals lay around in obvious depression, even refusing to eat. When Markowitz visited their native habitat, he found that the bulk of these animals' time was spent predating low-flying birds, their main source of food. He told the zoo that instead of feeding horse meat in chunks, which was what they were doing, the keepers should grind the rations into meatballs, which were then to be shot randomly across the exhibit enclosure by a compressed, computer-driven air cannon. I've seen films of this. It's beyond hysterical. The animals' behavior changed overnight. They became excited and active, clearly exercising the predating aspect of their telos. You know how pussycats get down and wiggle their little butts and then jump up in the air. Despite the power of the food drive, it was trumped here by failing to accommodate how they had evolved to eat. Similar strategies provide for telos accommodation for many animals in captivity. And by the way, I think societal concern for animals is very much conditioned by an inchoate notion of telos, hence the deep concern about keeping the orcas in a pool. Even if it was a quarter-acre pool, their natural range is hundreds of miles. Marmosets will bond as pairs for life. Separating such a pair can often lead to death of one of the partners, and so on. Clearly, if we wish to assure the well-being of research animals and are doing a good job controlling physical pain, the next step is to make sure that the animal's telos needs are respected in the way in which they are kept. Primates, simply presented with food, surely a very basic drive, will often not eat unless the food is randomly distributed in their cage litter, so they have to do some work to achieve proper nutrition. You all familiar with that? Other animals, wild and domestic, will endure pain and injury to escape close confinement. Though confinement agriculturalists in the United States claim that all needs of confinement sows, food, water, protection of the elements, protection from predators, are met in confinement, these animals escape when they can. I have never heard of a report of any of them trying to break back in. You know, well, I got to get back in the gestation crate, you know. Temple Grandin, my colleague, did an experiment like that when she was at Illinois. She took 10th generation land-raised pigs, which were bred for domestication, and turned them loose in the outdoors. And the first thing they did, inexorably, was head for a mud wallow, which shows you how strongly that drive is ingrained in them. Chickens, no Einsteins among the animal kingdom, will trade ad libitum feeding in confinement for sporadic access to food outdoors. Chickens will also work for food in confinement when given a choice of doing so. Monkeys and other animals will self-mutilate in deprived, impoverished environments. The pain, at least according to some ethologists, presumably providing some stimulation. Researchers know that animals can be trained by reward to willingly accept some physically painful experimental procedures. For instance, one of my friends was drawing blood from dogs daily for a vaccine study. Dr. Kessel here. She would enter the facility, play with each dog, draw the blood, and give the dog a treat after the draw. On one occasion, one of the dogs set up such a howl as she was leaving that she raced back to see if his paw was caught in the cage door. You know that sound they make, right? Yeah, 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 yeah. It turned out she had forgotten to draw blood from that dog, and he had missed his play and his treat, which bothered him far more than the blood draw. All of these examples illustrate three major points. One, pain as a physical phenomenon does not begin to capture all the ways that what we do to animals matter to them. Two, other things we do to animals can be worse for them than physical pain. Unfortunately, we have no word for many of the myriad ways we can harm or cause animals to suffer, not allowing a pig to forage, separating baby from mother at birth, stopping a chicken from nest building. For others, of course, we do have words, e.g., creating boredom, social deprivation, fear. And Françoise Wemmelfelder, do you know her? Ethologist, works with lab animals, has a wonderful paper of some length on boredom in laboratory animals. And three, in general, interfering or impeding with the actualization of telos creates a negative experiential state of affairs for an animal. Further, there is no simple word to express the many ways we can hurt animals besides creating physical pain. The ways are as countless as the multiplicity of teloi and the interests that flow from them. So I will introduce a very barbarous term to express this concept: negative mattering. Negative mattering means all actions or events that harm the animals or create misery, from frightening them to removing its young naturally early, so keeping it so it is unable to move or socialize, to Harry Harlow's barbarous maternal deprivation studies, where he concluded that if you take the baby monkeys away from their mother and give them barbed wire mothers, they grow up neurotic. Yeah. To social separation that can not only cause distress but lead to physical illness, causing grief. Physical pain is perhaps the paradigm case of negative mattering, but only constitute a small part of what the concept covers. Positive mattering, which is very important as the world changes, would of course encompass all states that are positive for the animal: freedom of movement, pleasure, a sense of security, companionship, play, interacting with conspecifics, and so on. If our analysis is correct, it is morally obligatory to expand the scope of veterinary medicine, laboratory animal science, ethology, animal science, animal welfare science, to study all the ways things can matter to negatively to animals as well as positively matter as society grows ever more concerned about animal treatment. This is really the challenge to the research community, to keep up with social expectations, and to do so without the need for legislation. In addition, it is necessary to understand which forms of negative mattering are most problematic from an animal's perspective. As I said earlier, the captivity of a coyote they care more about that than about the pain. Obviously, the challenge is to study these without hurting the animal subjects. An excellent example of this arises from the research into learned helplessness. You guys familiar with learned helplessness? Research in this area is so barbaric it has been banned in the UK for some time. Absurdly alleged to be a model for human depression, learned helplessness is achieved by subjecting an animal in a cage to inescapable electric shock, regardless of what it does. Eventually, the animal assumes a fetal position and does nothing. Have any of you seen this? It's not pretty. The horrible state arises rarely, if ever, in nature, and once again, there's no name for the feeling engendered. Ironically, now that we know about it, we can assume that it occurs in a regular way in animals housed in severely restrictive environments, such as sow stalls. As I have, can't read my handwriting. As I have frequently argued elsewhere, the concept of animal welfare is not simply an empirical concept, but contains inescapable ethical dimensions. What we owe animals and to what extent. And in my view, the best way to cash that out is in terms of respect for their telos. In sum, then, using telos as the core concept in animal ethics, rather than pleasure and pain, has numerous advantages. It helps us to understand our obligations to animals in higher resolution. It stops us from classifying insults as diverse as a blow, sickness, grief, loneliness, on a continuum of only one axis, pain, and of course, similarly with pleasure. It comports well with Darwin's realization that if physiological and morphological traits are phylogenetically continuous, so too are mental and psychological ones. It accords better with common sense, which has little trouble attributing mental states to animals. And equally important is the fact that as concern for animal welfare continues to evolve in society, it makes perfect sense of attributing happiness to animals, that is, satisfaction of most, or ideally all, of an animal's needs and interests arising from its telos. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. And I just want to add, on a very positive note, that I sense from my many visits to research institutions and talks at ALAS and so forth, as well as talks for you guys, that you're well aware of this. you know, and that you will be moving in this direction.
Thank you, Dr. Rollins. That was very, very interesting.
Thank you.
We do have time for questions. So if you would like to ask Dr. Rollins questions, I'd ask that you please come up to one of the 2 microphones so that we can pick it up for everyone to hear.
I'm underwhelmed.
Hi, Bernie.
Oh, hi, Joe. How are you?
Wonderful. So I have 2 thoughts. I mean, Bernie and I agree on many, many things. So I'm not picking a fight.
Anytime, buddy.
There's, discretion is the better part of valor, sir. So, as an empirical scientist, my animal behavior class, which incidentally, I was told I wasn't allowed to have a class called Introduction to Animal Behavior anymore, so I just renamed it Sex, Death, and Sometimes Food. The central concept I teach in that class is telos.
Really?
So, yeah. So I teach the entire class from the point of view of telos. And so the minor fight that I'm picking is that I think it is possible to teach hard science from an ethical and philosophical point of view.
Oh, I couldn't agree with you more, Joe.
Yeah, I thought so.
Yeah.
And
what, just to add, that not only is it possible, in the world we live in now, it's necessary.
Yeah. And the other sort of one of the key concepts that I get into in a lot of the talks that I give and I get into with these students is that, yes, there is a mouseness of mouse and a ratness of rat and a monkeyness of monkey, and you need to know that to understand the animal from its point of view. But there's also an animalness of animal, and that is control. So the telos, for me, of animals is that animals are designed to control the world, and when you take control away, then, as Bernie pointed out, you wind up with these terrible welfare problems. And so, again, I think there's ways of joining all of these ideas together. And
Yeah, and that's...
I'm just getting up here because nobody else did, and
Thank you.
just to fire off, but anyway.
Well, I
thank
mean, you put a lot of the points I made in a very pithy and intelligent way. But I had to talk for 35 minutes. So.
And with that...
Thanks, Joe.
Hello? Dr. Rollins?
Yes.
I'm over on this side.
On which side?
To his credit, the lights are very bright.
Okay,
And it's really
I'm on
hard
your
to see.
left.
Okay.
My name is Alice Huang from the VA. I agree with you that we can't ignore, or that we have a responsibility to join the ethical, moral, behavioral, telos side of things with the measurement of physical and chemical properties and so on and so forth. I'm a little bit uneasy with what sounds like you're saying that science should include that side of things. And maybe it's a semantic thing, but I think of that there's nothing wrong with a scientific ideology as long as we don't assume that that scientific ideology should cover everything. That is, that we exclude anything that's not in scientific ideology. As humans, it's perfectly fine to, or scientists, it's perfectly fine to pursue a scientific ideology as long as humans, we also include the other things.
I don't disagree with you at all, and you're making a good point. But historically, at least, the people who articulated scientific ideology tended to very strongly denigrate common sense, ordinary experience, and, as I indicated, ethics as well. So, I mean, like I mentioned, I taught biology for 20 years, and when we taught biology, We did teach it that way. We did raise the ethical and societal issues. And the failure to do that has not been helpful to science, whether it's laboratory animal science or whether it's the emerging science of genetic engineering. The fact is that you know, I don't know if you remember when Dolly was released, Time Warner did a survey of the American public. Fully 75% of Americans said that the creation of Dolly violates God's will. And I hold appointments in 2 science departments, biomedical science and animal science, and I'm very pro-science. I mean, I love science. It's how you know things. But if it continues along a path of the sort that it has, you're going to get the rejection of scientific discoveries for reasons that are not coherent. I mean, I was chilled to learn that 3 out of 4 of my fellow Americans are in direct touch with God's will. Next thing they'll be telling us, God wills we vote for Trump. Fair enough? My invisible presence out there? Okay.
Hi, Bernie. Thanks for a great talk. I know it was a great talk because it makes me feel slightly depressed for the decisions that I've made based on some of the animal research that I've overseen over the years. One of the things I want to be clear about is that perfect mattering would be equal to the animal's telos, I suspect. Unachievable, perhaps, in a clinical setting. But
correct.
Is that correct?
Yes.
Thank you.
Yes. And it's a very good point. Perfect anything is unachievable. But I think the important point I'm trying to make, and I think implicit in your sentence, is that we should work towards it as best we can. And there's no question that for a long time in the 20th century, we didn't even try. We didn't. And by the way, as you know, you're a vet, I assume? Okay. Just as knowledgeable, presumably. I've got a new book coming out that talks about the degree to which variables that radically affected scientific results were cavalierly ignored. Cavalierly ignored. I remember, sir, I gave a keynote speech to the Shock Society. They're people who study circulatory shock. And at that time, the big issue for the young researchers was when you were doing traumatic shock studies, usually created by putting the animal in the noble collop drum and having it spin 60 cycles a minute and creating random trauma, you were forbidden, if you wanted to publish your papers, to use any anesthesia or analgesia at all on the animals. Because after all, the person anesthetized, the person in a crash is not anesthetized. So you want to replicate, you want a model that replicates the situation. I pointed out to them, well, since you're so damn adamant about controlling for these variables, do you control variables like personality of the technician, which had been shown that year to have enormous ramifications on physiological parameters like deposition of cholesterol in arteries. And there are a whole myriad of such variables that were completely ignored. And what I said at the time, because I wasn't the sweet guy I am now, is then you guys should be ashamed of yourselves. If you don't control fundamentally basic variables that have no ethical import because it's inconvenient, you have no business withholding anesthesia. And it was very dramatic. The head of the society got up and said, I'm glad you raised that because I was just going to announce today that we're reversing that policy. We will no longer publish any papers that do not use anesthesia. Okay? Thanks.
Hi.
Oh,
See if
another
we
one
get
in the
the-
invisible corner.
Invisible corner. My name's Caitlin Kramer, and I'm here as a veterinarian. I think I represent somewhat of a minority in this group, is that I'm an ag animal veterinarian. And I wanted to come up and say something because I came to the ag animal world from the perspective of how do we improve telos in agricultural animal work. And you know, for want of a better word, I came from the granola part of the Northeast. So I grew up with, you know, the catchphrases sustainable agriculture and organic agriculture and all of those. And I went into the field and said, okay, yes, I'm going to change this field. And one of the things I've encountered as I've improved my education in this are the things that the catchphrases in agriculture animals. So gestation crates for sows, removing dairy calves at 2 hours of age from their mothers, and the psychological pain that that causes those animals. That's a problem, but there's also really good reasons for why that practice is implemented. Which doesn't necessarily say it's right, but when you're looking at sows when they're group housed, beating each other up and causing physical pain when they're in that group housing situation, or when you look at if you leave cows with their mother, what increases in diseases do you see? I think it represents a larger issue than just saying this is bad and we need to stop this practice. So I guess I wanted to come up here and comment on this, not because I disagree with your standpoint that this doesn't represent the telos of these animals, but that fixing this problem and addressing this problem is a very complex issue.
I agree with what
So-
you're saying, but I don't know that I agree with your examples. In 2008, the two senior executives of Smithfield Farms, the world's largest pork producer, came to visit me in Colorado. They took the corporate jet, much to my extreme envy. And we had a day and a half of discussions. And they said, they were very open. They said, if you were us, what would you do? And I said, I'd abolish gestation crates yesterday. And they said, why? I said, because if you go out and ask your consumer public, you would get extreme negativity. And they said, give us a number. What percentage of the public would not like gestation crates? And I said, off the top of my head, 80. I said, but don't take my word for it. Why should you listen to me? Go out and poll your public. And they didn't. They called me 6 months later and they said, you were wrong. I said, really? Okay, how was I wrong? They said, it's not 80%, it's 78%. And we want you to talk to the Wall Street Journal because we're announcing the elimination of sow stalls. They have 200 million sows around the world. I mean, they're an immense operation, immense. And they did, and they stuck by it. And gradually, a lot of other pork producers are moving in that direction. It's doable. I mean, I have pointed out to the national pork producers that people raised pigs quite successfully before anybody invented the gestation crate. In fact, my colleague Tim Blackwell and I, he's the chief swine veterinarian of Ontario, talked to the people who construct sow buildings and sow stalls, and they said they're very, very apt to encourage the small pork producers not to use gestation crates because the cost is in the ironwork, enormous amount of money in that ironwork, and these people are running on a small margin anyway when they can try to compete with the big guys. So I don't think just because something's been around for a long time and is convenient that it needs to be sustained. For a long time, as you're a veterinarian?
Correct.
Well, during my time teaching veterinary medicine at CSU, out of 140 vet students, we let maybe 3 or 4 women in a year in school. and now it's up to 90%. So things change. And I remember talking to Dr. Adams. Did any of you know Dr. Adams? The very prominent horse surgeon. And I said, Bob, why don't you want women in veterinary medicine? And he said, because what woman can handle a raging stallion? What's the obvious response to that? Yeah, what man can handle a raging stallion, you know? And I said, and if you're serious about that, Doc, eliminate the interviews and give every student who's applying a raging stallion. John Shattuck, who was dean at Texas A&M for a long time, told me about what Adam said. He said, you know, I'm 120 pounds, dripping wet. I can't handle a raging stallion by force. Got to use brains. So thanks for your comment. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, we're going to have to stop questions now so we can move on, but I would like to thank Dr. Rollins again for his speech.
Thank you, guys. And thank you so much for being on the cutting edge of change in the right direction. You can give yourselves a pat on the back.
Thank you, Bernie, and congratulations again on the Lifetime Achievement Award.